Damian Carter sat in the penthouse of his Chicago skyscraper. Staring at the skyline, the city stretched out before him, alive with lights and motion. But inside, he felt a hollowness that no amount of wealth could fill. The 45-year-old tech billionaire had built an empire from scratch. Yet something was missing, a legacy. He needed an heir, not for sentiment but for continuity. Someone to inherit and expand his empire. Love? He had tried and failed twice. And the notion now seemed like a distraction at best. A liability at worst. For Damian, the solution was simple. No entanglements. No risks. He wanted a child, but on his terms. A legal agreement. Clinical precision. Just like any of his billion-dollar deals. He tasked his assistant, Julia, to begin the search. Discreet inquiries led nowhere. Elite surrogates demanded more than he was willing to give. Then, one day, driving through the heart of the city, inspiration struck. It was a brisk fall afternoon. The streets were alive with commuters and street vendors. And Damian sat in the back of his Rolls-Royce, absently reviewing a set of contracts. As the car idled at a red light near a bustling intersection, something unusual caught his eye, a young woman sitting on the sidewalk, sketching intently on a piece of weathered paper. She was engrossed, her brown hair falling in loose strands over her face. Her clothes were worn, her boots scuffed, but there was something striking about her, a quiet determination, a defiance in her focus amid the chaos of the street. "Stop here," Damian instructed his driver abruptly. "Here, sir?" the driver asked. Surprised. "Yes, here." The car pulled to the curb, and Damian rolled down the tinted window. "You," he called, his tone sharp but not unkind. "Come here." The woman looked up, startled, her blue eyes locked onto his, narrowing in suspicion. "What?" she asked, clutching her sketchpad. "Come closer," Damian said, gesturing impatiently. "I want to talk to you." She hesitated. "I'm not interested. I'm not selling anything. I'm offering you an opportunity." Something in his voice gave her pause. Against her better judgment, she stepped closer to the car. "What kind of opportunity?" "Get in. I'll explain." Nina Harper, 27 years old, homeless for the past 6 months, had no reason to trust the man in the luxury car. Yet desperation often silenced reason. With a mix of curiosity and wariness, she climbed into the car. The rich leather and subtle scent of cologne contrasted sharply with the cold, chaotic streets she knew. Damian directed the car to a quiet cafe in the West Loop, where they sat at a secluded table. He introduced himself with the ease of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Nina remained guarded, sipping a coffee she hadn't asked for. "I'm looking for someone to carry my child," Damian said bluntly. "No attachments, no relationships, just a contract." Nina blinked, certain she had misheard. "Excuse me? Did you just say you want me to have your child?" "Yes." He leaned forward, his gaze unflinching. "I'll cover all expenses, provide for you during the pregnancy. And, at the end, you'll receive a significant financial settlement. Enough to start over, comfortably." Nina laughed dryly, crossing her arms. "You're insane." "No," Damian replied calmly. "I'm determined. I know what I want. And I get what I want. Think of this as a business arrangement, one that benefits us both." Nina's mind raced. The offer was absurd, yet the promise of security was tempting. She was tired of cold nights, of wondering where her next meal would come from. But the idea of reducing something so personal to a transaction made her stomach churn. "Why me?" she asked finally. "You can hire any surrogate you want. Because I see potential in you," Damian said simply. "You're resilient. And you're here." Damian gave Nina 24 hours to decide. As she walked the streets that night, his words echoed in her mind. The choice seemed impossible. Give up her autonomy for financial security or cling to her dignity and continue to struggle. Sitting on a park bench, she pulled out her sketchpad and began to draw, as she always did to clear her mind. Her mother's voice came to her, a memory from years ago. Opportunities don't always look the way you expect. Sometimes you have to take a leap. By morning, Nina's resolve had hardened. She couldn't live like this anymore. When she arrived at Damian's office, a sleek, glass-walled suite atop a downtown skyscraper, she was greeted by Julia, his efficient assistant. Damian met her with his usual calm confidence. "Have you made a decision?" "Yes," Nina said, her voice steady. "I'll do it." The contract was meticulous. drafted by Damien's team of lawyers. It outlined every detail of their agreement, medical care, living arrangements, and the final financial settlement. Nina read it carefully, feeling a mix of relief and dread. "This seems final," she said as she signed. "It is," Damien replied. "I don't leave room for complications." With the contract signed, Nina moved into Damien's sprawling estate in the affluent suburbs. The transition was jarring, plush carpets replaced concrete sidewalks, and gourmet meals arrived on a schedule. Yet, amid the luxury, Nina felt out of place. Damien, true to form, maintained a professional distance, monitoring her care through Julia. Nina Harper sat on the edge of the luxurious bed, staring at the opulent room that was now hers. The high ceilings, crystal chandelier, and silk curtains felt more like a hotel than a home. She ran her fingers over the plush duvet, thinking about how absurd it all seemed. Just days ago, she'd been sleeping on a park bench, and now she was in a mansion worth more than she could fathom. Julia, Damien's assistant, had shown her around earlier. The mansion had its own gym, a library filled with books Nina could never hope to read in a lifetime, and a garden so meticulously maintained it looked like a painting. "This will be your room," Julia had said, opening the door to a suite bigger than any apartment Nina had ever lived in. "If you need anything, just press this button, and staff will assist you." Nina had nodded, feeling overwhelmed. That night, she barely slept. The weight of the contract she had signed haunted her, even as she lay on the most comfortable bed she'd ever known. The idea of carrying a child for someone else felt clinical and detached. Yet it was her reality now. Damien kept his distance. Nina rarely saw him, except for the occasional passing moment during breakfast or when Julia updated him on her progress. He was always dressed impeccably, his movements precise and efficient. To Nina, he seemed like a machine, calculating, unemotional, and entirely in control. One morning, as she sipped her tea in the dining room, Damien entered, his phone pressed to his ear. He glanced at her briefly but didn't acknowledge her. Nina couldn't help but feel like a piece of furniture in his world, something that existed only to serve a purpose. "Good morning," she said, breaking the silence. Damien paused, ending his call. He looked at her, as if surprised she'd spoken. "Good morning," he replied curtly before returning to his phone conversation. As he left, Nina shook her head. What a robot, she thought. It wasn't until her first doctor's appointment that Damien's veneer began to crack. Nina was nervous. Her hands clenched as the ultrasound machine hummed beside her. The doctor applied the cool gel to her stomach and began the scan. "There it is," the doctor said, pointing to the monitor. The heartbeat, the rhythmic sound filled the room. Steady and strong. Nina's eyes welled with tears, overwhelmed by the realization that a life was growing inside her. She turned her head and saw Damien standing near the door, his arms crossed. For the first time, he looked unsettled. His usual calm was replaced by something Nina couldn't quite place. Curiosity? Awe? Fear? That's it? He asked, his voice uncharacteristically soft. The doctor smiled. Yes, that's your child's heartbeat. Damien's gaze remained fixed on the screen. He didn't say anything else, but Nina noticed the tension in his shoulders had eased. A few days after the appointment, Nina returned to her room to find a package on her bed. It was wrapped in elegant paper with a small note attached. To help pass the time. Inside was a sketchbook and a set of high-quality pencils. Nina's breath caught. She had mentioned her love for drawing once, during their first meeting, but she never thought Damien would remember or care. She ran her fingers over the smooth cover of the sketchbook, a lump forming in her throat. It was a small gesture, but it felt deeply personal. For the first time, she wondered if there was more to Damien Carter than the cold, calculating man he presented to the world. At her next doctor's appointment, Nina received news that would change everything. As the ultrasound progressed, the doctor frowned slightly, adjusting the machine. Is something wrong? Nina asked, her heart racing. No, the doctor said with a reassuring smile. Not at all. It looks like you're having twins. Twins? Damien and Nina said simultaneously, their voices filled with equal parts shock and disbelief. Yes, the doctor confirmed. 2 healthy babies. Nina's mind spun. The idea of carrying one child for a man she barely knew was already overwhelming. 2 felt monumental. She glanced at Damien, expecting his usual stoicism, but his expression was different. He looked awestruck. As they left the appointment, the silence in the car was heavier than usual. Nina finally broke it. "Well, this changes things." Damien nodded, his gaze distant. "Yes, it does." The news of the twins brought an unspoken shift between Nina and Damien. He began joining her for meals more often, asking questions about how she was feeling. Though his tone remained formal, there was a warmth to his words that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, Nina was in the garden, sketching a tree bathed in sunlight. When Damien approached, he stood behind her, watching quietly. "You're talented," he said after a while. Nina turned, surprised. "Thanks." He hesitated before adding, "I didn't mean for this arrangement to feel so impersonal. If there's anything you need, let Julia know." Nina raised an eyebrow. "Anything?" Damien nodded. "Within reason." "Okay," she said, a teasing smile on her lips. "How about a day where I don't feel like a prisoner?" Damien frowned but didn't respond immediately. Finally, he said, "I'll see what I can do." As the months passed, Nina found herself growing attached to the lives growing inside her. She would lie awake at night, her hands resting on her belly, feeling the twins' movements and wondering who they would become. Damien, too, seemed to change. He began spending more time at home, often finding reasons to check on Nina. One evening, as they sat in the library, Damien spoke quietly. "I never thought I'd be a father," he admitted, staring at the fire crackling in the hearth. "I thought it would be simpler." "It's never simple," Nina replied, "but maybe that's the point." For the first time, Damien smiled, a small, genuine smile that caught Nina off guard. The revelation of the twins had altered the rhythm of their lives. Damien's presence became more consistent, no longer confined to brief, perfunctory interactions. Nina began to notice subtle changes in him. The way he lingered at breakfast to ask about her day, or how he watched her with a mixture of curiosity and something she dared to call warmth. One evening, as the city lights sparkled in the distance, Damien invited Nina to the terrace for dinner. It was a rare gesture of openness, and Nina accepted, though she wasn't sure what to expect. "I wanted to thank you," Damien said, his voice quieter than usual as they sat beneath the soft glow of string lights. "Not just for agreeing to this arrangement, but for enduring me." Nina smirked, though she felt a pang of empathy. "You're not so bad, just a little intense." "That's a kind way of putting it," Damien said with a faint smile. "I've always been focused on control, my business, my life. I thought I could approach this the same way." "And now?" Nina asked, her tone softening. Damien hesitated, his gaze fixed on the skyline. "Now, I'm realizing that some things can't be controlled. These twins, they're not a project or a plan. They're real." The vulnerability in his words caught Nina off guard. For the first time, she saw not the billionaire but a man struggling to reconcile his need for order with the chaos of emotion. She felt herself softening toward him, though she tried to keep her guard up. As the months wore on, Damien and Nina fell into an unexpected rhythm. He accompanied her to doctor's appointments, where they watched the twins grow on the monitor. And he even attended a prenatal yoga class at Nina's insistence. The sight of Damien Carter attempting downward dog was a memory Nina knew she'd cherish forever. One evening, after a particularly long day, Damien surprised Nina by joining her in the library. She was sketching, her favorite way to unwind, and Damien sat across from her, a glass of whiskey in hand. "What are you drawing?" he asked. "Just the garden," Nina replied, tilting the sketchpad to show him the delicate strokes capturing the roses. "You have an eye for detail," Damien said, leaning closer. "I envy that." "You envy me?" Nina teased. The mighty Damien Carter, envious of a broke artist? "Not broke anymore," Damien reminded her. "And yes, you see beauty in things I'd overlook." The sincerity in his voice startled her. She smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't expected. Late one night, Nina was in the sitting room, absently rubbing her belly, when she felt it, a soft, distinct flutter. Her eyes widened, and she sat up straighter, waiting to see if it would happen again. A moment later, there it was, the unmistakable kick of one of the twins. "Damien," she called instinctively. He appeared moments later, his hair slightly tousled, as if he'd been working late. "What is it? Are you okay?" "Feel this," Nina said, grabbing his hand and placing it on her belly. "Just wait." Damien stood frozen, his hand resting gently on her bump. Then, he felt it, the tiny, powerful kick that seemed to echo in the silence. "They're moving," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They are," Nina said, her eyes shining. "It's amazing, isn't it?" Damien nodded, his expression softening in a way Nina had never seen. "It is." In that moment, something shifted between them. The distance that had once defined their relationship seemed to dissolve, replaced by an unspoken understanding. Despite their growing connection, doubts and fears lingered for both Nina and Damien. For Nina, the thought of giving up the twins haunted her. She had signed the contract knowing it was the only way to escape her circumstances. But now, with every kick and ultrasound, she felt a bond that couldn't be undone. For Damien, the idea of fatherhood felt increasingly overwhelming. He had spent his life avoiding vulnerability. Yet these children, and Nina, were unraveling his carefully constructed walls. One night, Damien found Nina in the nursery. The room, freshly decorated in soft pastels, was ready for the twins' arrival. Nina stood by the cribs, her hand resting on the edge of one. "They'll be here soon," Damien said, breaking the silence. "I know," Nina replied, her voice tinged with sadness. "What's wrong?" he asked, stepping closer. Nina hesitated before speaking. "I don't know if I can do this. Damien, I don't know if I can walk away." Her honesty caught Damien off guard. He had never considered the emotional toll this arrangement might take on her, or on himself. "You don't have to decide that now," he said, his tone gentler than she expected. "Let's take it one step at a time." The twins arrived on a stormy night. Nina woke to sharp contractions and called for Julia, who immediately summoned Damien and the medical team. The next few hours were a whirlwind of pain, anticipation, and raw emotion. Damien stayed by Nina's side, holding her hand through every contraction despite his discomfort. For once, he seemed completely unguarded, his concern for Nina and the babies evident in every glance. When the first baby, a boy, was born, Damien's breath caught. He stared at the tiny, squirming life in awe as the doctor handed him over. Moments later, the second twin, a girl, arrived, her cries filling the room. Nina, exhausted but overwhelmed with love, held the twins close. Damien sat beside her, his usual composure replaced by a quiet reverence. "They're perfect," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "They are," Nina agreed, tears streaming down her face. The next morning, Damien sat in his study. The contract spread out before him. He stared at the document that had once seemed so straightforward. Now, it felt like a barrier to something far greater. When Nina entered, he looked up, his expression serious. "I can't do this," he said, standing and tearing the contract in half. "Damien, what are you?" Nina began. But he interrupted her. "This arrangement, it was wrong," he said. "You're not just some surrogate. Nina, you're everything, and I can't let you walk away." Nina's heart raced. "Do you mean that?" "I've never meant anything more," Damien said, stepping closer. "Stay. Be with me. Let's be a family." Tears filled Nina's eyes as she nodded. "Okay." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of adjustments and joy. Damien and Nina navigated their new roles as parents, finding solace and strength in each other. Their love, once unexpected, blossomed into something genuine and enduring. One evening, as the twins slept in their cribs, Damien took Nina's hand. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" Nina asked. "For showing me what life can be," Damien replied, pulling her into a tender embrace. Months passed, and the once transactional relationship between Damien and Nina deepened into something profound. They navigated sleepless nights, shared the joy of the twins' first smiles, and learned the nuances of parenthood together. Damien, once a man of steel control, now found himself captivated by the simple moments, reading to the twins, bathing them, and even rocking them to sleep. One evening, after the twins had finally settled down, Damien invited Nina to the terrace for dinner. The soft glow of candlelight flickered against the dark night sky, and the distant hum of the city provided a serene backdrop. "What's the occasion?" Nina asked as she took her seat, smiling at the spread of her favorite dishes. Damien hesitated for a moment, then took a small velvet box from his pocket. He stood, his usual confidence tempered by a rare vulnerability. "This." Nina's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a simple yet elegant diamond ring. "Nina, you've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. You've shown me love, patience, and how to let go of the walls I've built. I can't imagine my future, our future, without you. Will you marry me? Tears filled Nina's eyes as she stood, her hand trembling as she reached for his. Yes, she whispered, 1,000 times. Yes. Damien slid the ring onto her finger and pulled her into a tight embrace. For the first time, they felt like the family they had become. The wedding was a quiet, intimate affair held in the garden of Damien's mansion. Close friends, Julia, and the staff who had become like family attended. The twins, dressed in tiny suits and gowns, were the stars of the ceremony, babbling happily as Nina and Damien exchanged vows. I promise to love you, not just for who you are, but for the person you've helped me become, Damien said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. And I promise to always remind you that love is messy, chaotic, and worth every moment, Nina replied, tears glistening on her cheeks. As they kissed, the small crowd erupted in applause, and the twins clapped their hands, mimicking the noise. Married life brought its challenges, but Damien and Nina faced them as a team. Nina embraced her role as both a mother and a partner, finding joy in raising the twins while rekindling her passion for art. Damien, once consumed by his work, learned to balance his responsibilities, ensuring he was present for his family. One afternoon, as Nina sketched in the sunroom, Damien entered with a mischievous grin. I have a surprise for you, he said, holding a large envelope. What is it? Nina asked, setting down her pencil. Open it and see. Inside was a deed to an art studio in the city, fully renovated and ready for use. Nina gasped, her hand covering her mouth. Damien, this is too much. It's not, he said, sitting beside her. You gave up everything to be part of this life. Now it's time for you to reclaim your dreams. Nina threw her arms around him, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered. Parenthood was far from perfect. The twins, now toddlers, had boundless energy and a knack for chaos. One morning, Nina found them covered in finger paint, giggling as they decorated the walls of the nursery. Damien, Nina called, laughing despite the mess. Your heirs are redecorating. Damien appeared, his suit impeccable as always, and froze at the sight. Well, he said after a pause, I suppose it's creative. Together, they cleaned up the mess, their laughter echoing through the house. Moments like these, filled with imperfection and joy, became the foundation of their lives. Not every moment was easy. Damien's business faced a crisis when a competitor attempted to undermine his latest venture. The stress threatened to pull him back into his old habits, prioritizing work over everything else. One evening, Nina found him in his study, buried in papers and visibly tense. You're slipping back into the Damien who shuts everyone out, she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. He looked up, his eyes tired. I don't know how to fix this. You don't have to do it alone, Nina said. Let me help you. Her words reminded him of the strength they shared as a team. Together, they worked late into the night, and by morning, Damien had a plan to turn the situation around. The experience reminded him of the importance of balance and the power of partnership. The twins' first birthday was a grand celebration. The mansion was filled with laughter, balloons, and the smell of freshly baked cake. Friends and family gathered to celebrate, and Damien, who had once avoided such events, found himself at the center of it all, holding one twin in each arm. Nina watched from across the room, her heart full. The man who had once been a stranger was now the love of her life, and the father of her children. She approached him, kissing his cheek. Happy? She asked. More than I ever thought possible, Damien replied, his eyes filled with gratitude. One quiet evening, after the twins had gone to bed, Damien and Nina sat on the terrace, watching the stars. Damien held Nina's hand, his thumb tracing circles on her skin. Do you ever think about how this all started? He asked. All the time, Nina replied. I never thought I'd find myself here, married, with kids, and happy. Neither did I, Damien admitted, but I wouldn't change a thing. You and the twins, you're everything to me. Nina smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. And you're everything to us. The years passed, and the twins grew into curious, bright children. Nina's art studio thrived, and Damien's business expanded, though he always prioritized his family. Together, they built a life filled with love, challenges, and the unshakable bond they had forged through their journey. One day, As they walked through the garden with the twins, Damien turned to Nina and said, "You know, I used to think my legacy would be the empire I built. But now I know it's this. Us." Nina smiled, her hand finding his. "And that's more than enough." The story of Damien and Nina was one of transformation, of finding love in the most unexpected circumstances and building a life together. One imperfect step at a time. It was proof that even the most guarded hearts could open. And that family wasn't just about blood, but about the love and trust they shared. Their journey was far from perfect, but it was theirs, and it was beautiful.